Welcome, everyone. This is Johnny at the Authors Guild Foundation. We're here for our Money Matters series on personal finance advice for authors and freelance writers. This is a timely topic that I hope isn't very evergreen. Turbulent markets, bracing for financial volatility. Thanks, as always, to the National Endowment for the Arts and our many sponsors who enable us to present programs like this free to the public, any writers who are interested. The foundation is the charitable arm of the Authors Guild, and besides the foundation's public educational programs, the Guild offers member services like contract reviews and other legal advice, insurance programs. We build websites for authors, lots of other great stuff in our community. So check out authorsguild.org if you're not already a member, please. Um, I'll introduce our gracious host now, Erin Lowry. Erin is the author of the four-part Broke Millennial series, including Broke Millennial Takes on Investing, and Broke Millennial Talks Money, and Broke Millennial Workbook. She's been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CBS Sunday Morning, CNBC, The Rachael Ray Show. She's written for the New York Times, USA Today, and as a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. With that, I don't know about the marketplace, the stock market, so I will go off camera now. You can pop questions in the Q&A, and Erin will get to those after a little bit of a presentation. Erin, thanks.
Thanks, Johnny. Hi, everyone. Wonderful to be back with you. And sorry for such a heavy topic, but today we're talking about bracing for volatile financial times and how to deal with recession fears. Now, as always, especially when you're talking about the stock market and investing, got to give you a little bit of a disclaimer. You might have seen it when you signed up that this webinar is for informational purposes only. I will not be making or providing specific guidance on investments to make. We're just going to be talking about the stock market generally, how things work, how better to understand it. Also, I just want to add as kind of a personal caveat here. If you are getting prescriptive investing advice from somebody on the internet who doesn't know you, doesn't know your risk tolerance, doesn't know your financial goals, doesn't know your overall financial picture, you want to be really wary about that advice because those are all pieces of the puzzle that should come into play when building out your investment plan. And it should not just be somebody randomly on TikTok or Instagram or YouTube or even a money TV show that's telling you exactly how you personally should be building a portfolio without knowing anything about you personally. Just my little stump speech when it comes to getting financial advice from the internet and then enacting that on your investment portfolio. First things first, the stock market is not the economy. That is one thing I want to make really clear up top and to discuss throughout today's presentation. The stock market behaviors and the health of the economy are often conflated. As soon as the stock market gets a little bit rocky, a little bit turbulent, you start to hear the murmurs of the word recession. All of a sudden, people are starting to worry about a recession. Is a recession pending based on the behaviors of the stock market? Now, the two can be deeply correlated, but the stock market itself is not the economy. And just because the stock market is experiencing a dip, even if it's a bear market, which a bear market means that there's been a 20% drop from a recent peak and a sustained downturn in the stock market's performance. But even if we're in a bear market, that does not necessarily mean we are in a recession. So, what is a recession? Every single person on this webinar today, and I'm also betting anybody watching in the future, has experienced a recession. You might have been young when it happened, but everybody has experienced one. In simplest terms, a recession is a prolonged period of negative economic growth in a country. So for us in the United States, it's the National Bureau of Economic Research that is the organization that declares whether or not the US is in a recession. But the tricky thing is, it usually takes a few months to get the data to be able to determine whether or not we are or were in a recession. Now, of course, it can feel like a personal recession long before it is announced that one is actually here, or even if one never actually materializes and comes to fruition. Thinking back over the last couple of years, there have been people for whom it did feel like a personal recession for a multitude of reasons, even though economic indicators were strong and we were not in a recession. Now, for those who want to feel a little bit more technical about this, the data that's used in order to determine whether or not the United States is in a recession includes real income, an individual's purchasing power after considering inflation, employment levels, how much industrial producers output, how much wholesale retailers are selling, and the gross domestic product, GDP, or just the overall value of goods and services produced during a time period. And the average recession since the 1960s has lasted 11 months. Of course, some are much shorter. Looking at the COVID-19 pandemic recession, that was actually declared after it was already over. It only technically lasted 2 months as a recession, so it was kind of a blip. But the stock market went through all sorts of journeys over those years. So let's get into that a little bit more. Why is the stock market so reactionary? Well, the stock market reacts to what is happening both domestically and globally. Investors, and therefore by extension the stock market, dislike uncertainty. Any level of distrust, nervousness, unease, or panic will disrupt the market, especially because people might be inclined to panic sell. So all of a sudden, if everyone else is doing it, it's kind of that herd mentality, and people start to panic and start to sell. And then it just, catapults into some of what we've been seeing lately. And I should also continue the future. It says April of 2025. So the roots of these specific turbulent markets are, of course, the tariffs. Now, unfortunately, there is nothing I can do to completely put you at ease, to make you feel like, oh, I'm going to log in and check my investment portfolio and I see the angry red numbers and the down arrows. I don't know why brokerages have to do that to us, because it looks so violent when you log in, or all of this news and media that you're going to be hearing. I can't prevent that from happening. But what I can give you is a playbook for how to, for yourself, handle a downturn in the market. And the first thing is just being deeply practical about the fact that it's coming eventually. Every single person who is going to be invested for an extended period of time. So, most investors, most of us will be investing in the stock market, at least in our retirement accounts, our 401ks, our 403bs, IRAs, or a health savings account, a 529 to plan for your child's education. All of these kind of accounts should be invested, at least in part, in the stock market. And for those of us who are decades away from retirement, or even people who are retired, they still should have some level of exposure to the stock market. We know, based on historical data, it's cyclical. There will be bear markets, there will be bubbles, there will be corrections, there will even be a crash. Inevitably, for long term investors, we're going to experience one, if not all of those. The next thing to know is what is going on in the world. The markets, like I mentioned before, react to uncertainty. So knowing what is happening both domestically and internationally, that can help you contextualize why the market might be taking a tumble. One thing, as a bit of a history nerd and lover, that I like to do is turn to the past for a little bit of comfort. Stock market history is providing us with over 150 years of data that can also help us contextualize and provide some level of comfort that recovery will come. And we say that because it always has. So I want to go through a briefish history of the stock market in hopes that knowing a couple of these data points can also help provide you with a little bit of comfort and relief. Because as I said, it's a cyclical beast. It goes through corrections, bubbles, crashes. What goes up must come down, but then it tends to go up again. Now, some of the most infamous crashes are, of course, the Great Depression, Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. After the bull market of the 1920s, so going up, people were buying, buying, buying. That's a bull market as opposed to a bear market. People are selling, selling, selling. So after the bull market of the 1920s, many stocks were overvalued and the American economy was already showing signs of a decline. The crash started on October 24th, 1929, and the final day was October 29th, Black Tuesday, in which resulted a total of $30 billion in losses. And that's in 1929 dollars. So by 2025 dollars, that would be over $500 million of losses. By 1932, investments were only worth 20% of what they might have been worth pre-crash. Now, this also caused a run on the banks, which, if you've ever watched It's a Wonderful Life, you might be familiar with that scene where George Bailey is in his bank and taking money out of an envelope that was supposed to be for his honeymoon, trying to make his customers whole. Everybody there is demanding to pull all of their money out of his bank. That was a run on the bank, people panicking to take their money out. Banks could not meet customer demand, and many of them closed. So, this actually inspired the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, which is what backs banks today and provides us with some level of comfort. Now, there are some people who will say that it took 25 years to recover to pre crash levels after the Great Depression. But keep in mind, the US did fight in World War II during that time. But other people will say that the real recovery actually started around 1936. And people who are able to keep their investments in actually came out pretty far ahead. And it did not take them anywhere close to 25 years. It took them much closer to about 6, 7, 8 years to see true recovery. Now, Black Monday, which probably many people on this webinar either personally remember or experienced or we were at least alive for, Black Monday started on October 19th, 1987. I don't know what it was with October and these crashes, but this particular crash started in the Hong Kong markets, then spread to Europe, and then hit the United States when our market opened. But the indicators of a turbulent market were looming in the United States quite a bit before. The recovery, though, was fairly quick, and it went back to pre-crash highs within 2 years. Now, the next one, which is probably big in the memory of many people on this webinar watching this, the dot-com bubble and crash of 2000 to 2002. This was speculation over the internet in its infancy, which ultimately caused a crash or a bubble and then a crash, with so many tech companies being way overvalued. But in addition, if we think about how what is going on both domestically and globally impacts our markets, within this span, we also experienced 9/11, which had huge impacts on our market and the global market. And not too long after that was the big one, the Great Recession. So 2007 to 2009 was technically this recession. Although for those of us who were in college during this time and then graduated into a very shaky job market, it did not feel like we were technically out of a recession. It felt like we were very much still in. The subprime mortgage crisis triggered a major financial meltdown in both the housing market and the stock market. Mortgage-backed securities had been sold to investment and financial institutions and then ended up in pension funds and mutual funds. And that's part of how these two markets were so enmeshed at the time. But the big thing to remember here is that investors who stayed in the stock market during the Great Recession went on to experience one of the longest bull runs in stock market history. So when recovery started in 2009, it went on to be a major bull run in the US stock market for 11 years. So people who left their money where it was were able to be made whole again very quickly and then experience big returns. And people who were starting to invest at that time also only experienced a very strong, healthy stock market for many, many, many years, which I'll be coming back to that a little bit later. And most recently, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic was a very short-lived market panic with a quick recovery. But the bear market actually kicked off in late 2021 and early 2022, and it lasted most of 2022. So that was our most recent bear market. We've had a down market in the stock market just 3 years ago. Now, to go back to our playbook, another huge thing that I hope everyone can take away from this is learning how to contextualize headlines. We're writers. We understand the importance of words. But we also know that sensationalism works and matters, and if it bleeds, it leads is sometimes the mantra of the day. And that also applies to financial news. One of my favorite examples of this is actually from all the way back in 2018. The stock market went through a few small corrections in the middle of that big bull run that we had been on for 11 years, or would be on for 11 years. One headline I remember reading at the time proclaimed, "Biggest point decline in history." That is so big, so bold, and frankly, so scary. And it was technically true, but it also did not provide the context that the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is, they're talking about that in the biggest point decline, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average is just an index of the stock market, which is a statistically significant number of companies that then is considered and looked at to extrapolate what the overall stock market is doing and the overall health of the market. So the Dow Jones had set a closing record at 26,616.71 points on January 26, 2018. So when it went into free fall and plunged, which were all actual words and terms used in this article, the following week, It actually was still higher than it had been just 5 weeks prior, because again, it had set this closing record high. And if it drops, I don't know, 1,000 points, and that feels like, oh my gosh, that's major, that's scary, that's the biggest point drop in history. Yeah, it's like technically biggest point drop, but percentage wise wasn't even close. So similar language can get used all of the time. And in the last couple of weeks, and I'll be honest, it's been scary out there. I'm not trying to say like, oh, the markets are just being hyper or oh, the headlines are being hyperbolic. It's been freaky. But it's also important to be able to contextualize what people are saying. One of the big ones I've been noticing is instead of referencing point drops or biggest decline in that way, there's been a lot of conversation around the amount of money that has been quote unquote wiped out of the stock market in all of this turmoil. But it's also important to understand that they're just talking about market value that can also be regained. Not only can it, but historically it has been regained. So it's very easy to be panicked when you hear that billions or trillions of dollars have been wiped out overnight. But if the market dips, it also can go back up and that those funds can come back. Now, a down market is still stressful and it does have financial consequences, but understanding how to decode inflammatory headlines hopefully can help us all relax just a little bit. Another option is just wait a day. Consider waiting a day before making any knee jerk financial decisions because sometimes market volatility is just a blip. Selling in a downturn, though, means that you do have to make three important decisions. You have to decide when you're getting out, when you're getting back in, and what you're going to do with that money in the meantime, because it is very unlikely that you're going to actually time all of those correctly. And I'll go back to reference people who, in between 2007 and 2009, panicked about the market during the Great Recession and pulled some, if not all, of their money out of the market. And then we're debating when to get back in. And if you didn't get back in before 2009, when it started to go back up, you missed a lot of wealth building opportunities. And let's say if you waited till 2010, 11, I'm just gonna wait to see if it dips back down first so I can put money back in on a dip and then have it go back up. You really lost a ton of opportunities and it didn't dip significantly for quite a while. Another option, of course, is to speak to someone. Get your advisor on the phone if you have one. If you don't, this might be a time to hire one, particularly if you are near or in retirement. Or talk to a friend or a family member who you know has a lot of investing experience and isn't a reactionary. Another option, do not look at your portfolio right now. Be informed. It's important to be informed about what is going on, but it doesn't mean that you have to look at the specifics of what is going on with your portfolio and seeing temporary damage being done. Now, I say that, and there is one big caveat here. It's if you know that your portfolio is in alignment with what your actual goals are. So if you know that you've recently rebalanced it and it's in an asset allocation, these are all terms we're going to get into in a little bit, but you've rebalanced it and you're comfortable with the asset allocation and it's in perfect alignment with your age and your intended retirement goals, and you feel good about all of that, then just don't open up your specific account and look right now. And if you're feeling really unsure if your portfolio is in a good place, again, this is a great time to hire a professional, something we will also discuss a little bit later. And then stick to your plan. Have that right asset allocation for your age and for when you need access to that money. Be well diversified and then tune out the noise to the best of your ability. Now, one question that did come in, and I've also just been seeing this kind of all over the internet and even people asking me personally right now, should you buy the dip? This is a really common question. And what it means is, should you invest money into the stock market and buy stocks while it's low? Because effectively, it means that the stocks are on sale. My big thing is, it isn't worth anyone's effort to try and time the stock market, especially in, yes, economic uncertainty can absolutely provide opportunity for some people, but this is not the moment that you should try to become a stock picker. Instead, a good strategy is to just keep contributing to your retirement plans like a 401k, a SEP IRA, a solo 401k, a traditional or Roth IRA, and make sure that your investments are well diversified and that you are not trying to pick individual stocks. Now, for those who do want to keep investing, whether that is in a retirement account or whether that's in a taxable brokerage account, you can also use a strategy known as dollar cost averaging. By contributing to the stock market on a consistent basis, so let's say monthly, you will be hitting the market at different cost points. Sometimes it's high and the prices are more expensive, but if it's low, you get a deal. So you aren't trying to time the market, you're simply being consistent. And as a byproduct of that, you are hitting the market at different points. And so sometimes you'll buy the dip, but also sometimes it'll be a little more expensive. Now, there's another option called lump sum investing, and that is for investors who wait until the market or just a particular investment or asset class dips, and then they try to buy in order to get a deal. Both dollar cost averaging and lump sum investing are effective ways to be an investor, but dollar cost averaging is often better for folks who do not want to spend a lot of time monitoring the market, who tend to get panicked or stressed in a volatile market. Those are the type of folks who just should kind of automate it, make sure that you are contributing to your retirement account with every paycheck, or at least doing it maybe when you do your quarterly estimated taxes. You're still dollar cost averaging if you're doing chunks at various points as opposed to just kind of waiting and putting one huge lump in. Now, both have their risks and their benefits. So the question really for you should be, what is your risk tolerance and what type of investor do you want to be? Also, of course, in all of this, a lot of concern is around protecting your nest egg. It is a dangerous move to completely bail out of the stock market, which means potentially selling all of your stocks while the market is down. So that is known as locking in your losses. And one of my favorite lines about the stock market is you haven't lost or gained until you've sold. Another way to think about this is that if the stock market is down 7% and you withdrew 3% of your portfolio, you personally are now down 10%. So instead of bailing out entirely, one option is to rebalance your portfolio to better align with your goals and the current market climate. It's always a good idea to consult a professional to ensure how to handle rebalancing your portfolio. And also to provide a gut check, especially if you're a bit risk averse and your inclination is to move everything out of stocks and into cash or cash equivalents or other very, very modest investments. Now, what does rebalancing your portfolio mean? I've mentioned it several times at this point. So, all that is moving money from one asset class or type of investment to another to align with your risk tolerance. So, most investing platforms, and by that I mean like your Fidelities, your Vanguards, your Charles Schwabs, those kind of brokerages, most of those platforms have a feature that show how much of your money is in different asset classes. So this is known as asset allocation. Some of them, it just says asset allocation and you can click and it comes up with this nice little graph and it'll be like, this chunk is in stocks, this chunk is in bonds, this chunk is in cash. Now, let's say that you're 40 and you've decided that you want to have at least 55% of your overall portfolio invested in stocks and 45% invested in less aggressive assets like bonds or even cash. But you didn't pay attention for a year or two, and the stock market actually did quite well. So your investments went up, and now the percentage of your portfolio that's in stocks is at 70%. So what you want to do is move 15% of that money, and you could do that and in order to go back to your 55-45 split, that 55% stock, 45% bonds and cash. And what you could do is you could sell some of the stocks and then use that cash to buy bonds in order to rebalance your portfolio from 70-30 to 40 to 55-45. Or you could just keep contributing to it, but only be contributing to bonds and cash in order to balance it back out. Now, one thing to know about rebalancing is that it can have tax consequences for you if you sell one investment to buy another. Rebalancing in a tax advantaged account, so again, your 401k, your 403b, IRA, HSA, health savings account, or a 529 plan, those do not have tax consequences if you're tinkering around within them. But if you're rebalancing in a taxable brokerage account, it could result in a capital gains tax if you sell for a profit. Another big consideration right now and always is diversification. Diversification isn't just about stocks versus bonds versus cash or other asset classes. It's also about investing outside of the United States. There are options to invest into international markets as well as into our own. And yes, this can be done from your American brokerage account. You don't have to be opening up investment accounts in different countries in order to get access to their markets. But making sure that some of your money is invested outside the US can also help hedge against turbulent US markets because not all markets rise and fall together. Even though they're very interconnected and it can send tremors into other markets, they are not all moving in unison all the time. If you are concerned about financial stability from an income perspective, then you might consider right now that you're thinking, oh, I might just press pause investing entirely. That includes putting any money into my retirement accounts because I just feel like this money could be better used to shore up cash reserves or to pay off debt or be doing other things and be really meaningful for me. That's totally understandable. And in some cases, honestly, could even be a good idea for some folks. If you have a lot of concerns about your income potential and your financial stability, and you feel like, you know what, my cash reserves, my savings account doesn't look that great, and I'm trying to pay off some high interest credit card debt, okay, press pause on contributing to the stock market for a little bit. But be very wary of cashing out, especially of a retirement account. So, panicking and trying to take all of your money out of the stock market, just be careful about that kind of move because if you wait too long to start investing again or you move everything into cash, it does set you up potentially to miss out on the growth opportunity that could be in the recovery part of this process. So, again, that's why it can be incredibly beneficial to speak to a professional because they can help not only assuage some of your anxieties, but really give you proper information based on your specific situation, what makes the most sense for you to do. Because for some people, it does make sense to move some of their investments into cash or cash equivalents right now within their retirement account. I'm not saying to cash out and pull it out of your retirement account. Again, that could come with tax consequences. And for some people, again, it does make sense to press pause a little bit on putting any money in the market so they have that cash on hand for other big financial concerns that could come up. But you just want to be really careful about not getting stagnant about it in the future or being too scared to invest in the future. All right, we're going to transition into recession proofing finances here in a moment. So I just want to take a second to press pause, look at any questions. I also understand that some people feel like right now this has nothing to do with cycles, has everything to do with policy tariffs. But again, it's reacting to uncertainty. They're worried. People are worried about currently what the president is doing, what the tariffs are, what decisions are going to be getting made. But this is also true of almost any former president. Anytime they made big moves, it tended to trickle into the stock market as well. And I agree that it's scary and we are in unprecedented times, but we've also been in unprecedented times before. What should a senior do if she doesn't have 10 years for the market to bounce back? So, this is an excellent example of why it is so important to look to speak to a professional if you have that opportunity. And for some people, that opportunity can actually come up with looking at your brokerage and seeing if they have someone that you can call. Even, and this isn't always my favorite option, but even if there's like a robo advisor version to have just some level of backup, but have somebody else who is a professional who does this for a living to help you figure out what makes the most sense. I'm going to be getting into the mechanics of what that person should look like in terms of credentials and all of that a little bit later on. But just keep in mind that if you had not rebalanced previously, and maybe this is really scary because you are perhaps have a huge amount of your money in the stock market, in actual stocks and not in bonds or things that are a bit more conservative, again, makes a lot of sense to talk to a professional. All right, so some of these I will be getting into when we are in our next session. And what about the tax consequences if you had moved everything from stocks into cash or cash equivalents at the peak? So again, the tax consequences depends entirely on whether or not you were in a tax advantaged account, 401k, IRA, 403b, a retirement account of some point or form, or if you are working within a taxable brokerage account. So if you have a taxable brokerage account and you sold for a profit, you may, depending on situations, have to pay capital gains tax. So I can't speak to your specifics, but you'd be, ultimately getting paperwork that you have to file with your taxes. And when you do your taxes, you'll find out how much you have to pay. All right, we're going to move on into recession proofing your finances. So, very early on in my self employment journey, I really started to stress about what would happen in a recession. So, this was back in 2019. And people may or may not remember, there was a lot of talk about a looming recession in 2019 because we had been on that aforementioned bull run for so long. So, at that point, it had been 10 years. And there, again, the cycles, what goes up must come down, but then historically it does go back up. So there was a lot of chatter, and we had seen a couple of little market corrections in 2018. So there's so much conversation around like a recession's coming, a recession's coming, a recession's coming. And I really started to freak out a little bit. I was only a couple years into my self-employment journey, had never weathered a down market, wasn't sure what that was going to look like. And I decided to do something about it by creating what I then called a doomsday budget. But then COVID-19 happened. So I rebranded this to the Bare Essentials budget. Now, this is different than the classic emergency fund. An emergency fund is a pool of money that is set aside and best utilized when you are walloped with an unexpected expense or when you lose all of your income at once and you need to live off reserves. A doomsday budget or a bare essentials budget is a plan that is deployed when there is a significant reduction in income. Now, before we discuss how to set one up, I do want to talk about another major financial change that I personally implemented in 2019 that could also be very useful to you right now or just generally. Put yourself on a salary, regardless of your business structure. Being a writer comes with high income months and low income months. So sometimes those royalties or advances hit, or you get a big job. And then sometimes it feels like a barren wasteland. So I know that next month I am going to make significantly more than I did this month because royalty checks for two of my books are going to come in. One of, if not the most stressful part of earning a variable income is figuring out how to live within these feast and famine cycles. And the simplest way to stabilize your financial life is to pay yourself a salary. And it was about 6 years ago that I put myself on a salary to just stabilize my financial life month to month. This was years before my business was structured as an S corporation and I was required to run a payroll. What I did was determine how much I needed month to month to cover my basic expenses. And then I added some extra to account for living a higher quality of life than the bare minimum and to also fund some savings and investing goals. And before being on payroll, like I am now with an S corporation, all I would do was simply move this sum that I had deemed my salary from a checking account that was earmarked for my business to my personal one each month. And it was like I was paying myself an actual salary. And then I would also budget just my regular life budget based on that salary. It is essential to be separating your personal and your professional funds. If you decide to incorporate your business at some point, or you already have, then you will legally have to set separate business accounts up and use them exclusively for business funds. But if you're a sole proprietor who does not legally need a business bank account, you can still set one up. You just use a personal checking account that you exclusively use for business. Have all of your checks deposited into that account and just mentally know this is my runway, this is the money that I have for my business. It is a way for you to physically and mentally separate funds. And you can do the same with a credit card too. You can have one that's just earmarked for business costs. So, how and why a regular paycheck helps? It is so easy to overspend or to then try to play catch up when you have those high income months, but then you're really stressed about how to make ends meet during those low income times. Determining and paying yourself a monthly salary kind of helps level out some of these chaotic feelings. It also helps your money accumulate during those feast months, and those really add up and then build a nice reserve for yourself to help sustain you during the leaner times. Obviously, this is not 100% foolproof, but so if you go through a very long sustained downturn, it's possible to run out of that runway. But it's also part of the reason the bare essential budget can come into play because you can adjust your income in order to try to elongate your runway. Now, before we go back to the bare essentials budget, I do want to say I've done an entire webinar called Paying Yourself on a Variable Income on this topic. So if you want to learn more or you feel like that was so fast, there was so much information, please go check out that in our resource library. So it's Paying Yourself a Salary on a Variable Income. Okay, back to the bare essentials budget. The core question at the root of this budget is how much do you need to cover your most basic essentials in a month? It is with this information that you build a framework to both provide yourself peace of mind and handle a financial crisis. So let's walk through how to build your own. So it starts with knowing what is your monthly take-home pay. So that's why I wanted to have that aside to explain, even if you are self-employed, you can create a salary and pay yourself a salary so you know how much is your actual monthly take-home pay. So this is also funds, so it's your net pay that you want to be thinking about. So after taxes, insurance premiums, union dues, retirement plan contributions, et cetera, et cetera. And this number is also especially powerful for self-employed folks who are stressed about this month-to-month number. Another thing to know as you are building this bare essentials budget is you want to press pause on all unnecessary subscriptions, as well as press pause on aggressive debt repayment and savings goals. That's only for when you're on this bare essentials budget. So there's two ways to prepare to do this. The first, write out a list of all the subscription services that you use, and do not forget to add in those ones that bill annually or semi-annually. And then determine which, if any, are necessary for you to have during extremely lean financial times. Save this list so that you can act fast if you ever have to pivot and be on your bare essentials budget. Next, look up the minimum required payment to keep all of your debts current and from falling into default. So you go and look up whether it's credit card debt, loans that you're paying off, go and look and see the bare minimum that you have to pay. And I'll usually say minimum due is technically the term, in order to make sure that, like, hey, at least I'm staying current. Is interest going to be accumulating? Is that whole side of thing painful? Yes, it is. But at least staying current on your monthly payments means that you are protecting your credit score. Once you write down all of those minimum monthly payments, make sure that you total that all up and a lump sum that you need to be adding to your bare essentials budget in order to at least stay current on debts. We're not looking at the grand total due on all debts, just the minimum payments you have to be making. All right, I am going to quickly share my screen for the next couple of slides because I know some of us are more visual creatures and that is helpful when talking numbers. All right, so playing this from current slide. So when we're actually building out the final budget, one of the big questions I always get asked is, how do you handle annual expenses? Because some of your expenses might be billed annually or semi-annually, like car registration, insurance, memberships, etc. So look up all of those annual costs, divide them by 12 to know how much per month you should be setting aside to prepare for the payment. So let's say that I pay $650 a year in renter's insurance, divided by 12, that's $54.16 per month. So I would put $55 per month aside into an account earmarked for bills. I actually do have a bank account that is just for bills like this. So I just always have a surplus in there. So when auto insurance hits, when renter's insurance hits, when anything else like that comes up, oh, I already have the money set aside. This actually doesn't have to be a stressor in my monthly budget. You are so prepared for annual payments and you are never blindsided by them. The other thing to consider are some of those irregular and variable expenses that you might have to have, like household goods, toiletries, things like that might be monthly needs, but kind of vary month to month how much you have to spend. What you could do is you could just go back and look at the average over a few months and just use that number as kind of your placeholder when you're building out your budget for how much you should be setting aside for irregular and variable expenses. Frankly, when I'm doing these kind of budgets, I always like to add about a $100 buffer to it, because it could either be that, oh, I kind of forgot to add something when I was originally doing it, or it could be I underestimated how much something was going to cost. So having that buffer just kind of protects you in the future. Now, finally, as you're building out this bare essentials budget, you create a grid and then fill in your monthly costs for all of your bare essential living expenses. And this should include things like your housing costs, your rent or mortgage, your HOA or co op or condo fees, property taxes, everything else related to your housing costs that you will have to pay in order to stay current, even in a bare essentials moment. Utilities, electric, internet or cable, water, gas, phone, transportation costs. Those might be able to get modified a little bit. Maybe you're not driving quite as much or going to places quite as often. But if you have to get to a job or if you have to get to other things, you're still going to have transportation costs. And then, of course, food, household goods, medicine, childcare and or pet care, insurance premiums, those minimum debt payments that I mentioned before, and any miscellaneous items that are specific to you. That grand total number, that is your bare essentials budget number. It provides a very good baseline for how much to also have in your emergency fund. All right. So now that we have an understanding of how the bare essential budget works, I just want to share a little bit for me personally. I'd created this back in 2019 with the whole rumors of a recession looming because I thought, oh, if a recession does hit, there's a good chance that some of my income is going to dry up. Not just like, oh, the stock market. I was very concerned about what that would mean for my finances. Well, none of us obviously could see coming what happened in 2020. But for me, much like for many other people, the bottom did fully fall out. I want to say it was between 70 and 80% of the income that I had planned for, that even had signed contracts for. Things were just getting canceled left and right. And so I very fast, starting in April of 2020, I deployed my bare essential budget. I drastically reduced how much I was actually spending in a month, how much I was paying myself. So that was going to allow my business bank account to really be able to extend the runway that I had built in there during those feast times, because now I was in a famine time. And it worked. Like, being able to be on that reduced budget, not having to panic in the moment, was huge. Having these systems in place so that when my reptilian brain was taking over and I was feeling really stressed, I already had a plan in place, was a huge amount of relief and protection and comfort at the time that it happened. And it meant that I was able to sustain until work started to come back and I was able to kind of replenish the coffers, as it were. Another big thing, of course, is that it's important to take stock of your resources. You need to know, what is your wider social safety net? Are there friends who can be of assistance? Are there family members or friends that you could move in with or could even provide a short-term loan without financially compromising themselves? How strong is your professional network? If you need help finding a new job or new clients, would you be eligible for unemployment if you lost your job or your main source of income? These are all questions to think about ahead of time. And again, we're writers, write it down. I truly recommend just like having these things listed out somewhere so that when you are in panic and when you are in fear mode, you have already thought all of this through. And also making sure that you research federal and local programs that could provide assistance. At this point, maybe focusing more on local and state programs than necessarily federal options. For those who are retired or close to retirement, I acknowledge this is an incredibly scary time because you've made a plan, you've done all of the right things, and now it looks like things are just getting rocked financially, especially in terms of the stock market. What is hard about that is typically retirees still want some level of exposure to stocks, especially younger retirees, because your retirement fund may need to last you for 2, 3, 4 decades. So if you are sitting exclusively in cash and cash equivalents, it could be harder for that retirement portfolio to sustain and last, depending on how much you're withdrawing out of it every single year. So, if you're taking 5% out of it every year in order to pay for your life, but you're invested in CDs that are only at 3% or 4%, it means it's not sustaining, it's not keeping up with how much you're drawing down, which is why usually the advice is to have at least some level of exposure to stocks. Now, the bare essentials budget can be particularly helpful for retirees, especially during turbulent times, who are just looking to minimize how much they actually have to withdraw out of their portfolio. And ideally, You would hope you could avoid actually with selling any sort of stocks at this point and only be withdrawing out of cash. Of course, the other aims are to lower expenses as much as possible for those who are close but not yet retired, possibly delaying retirement by maybe 6 months to a year, or looking at picking up, some clients or some part-time work, anything to kind of help weather turbulent financial times. Another big consideration to have is, when did you last rebalance your portfolio? And is it in alignment with where you currently stand in retirement and how long you think those funds need to last you? You might have heard the old rule of thumb: 100 minus your age equals the percentage of stocks you should hold. So 100 minus, let's say you're 60, 100 minus 60 means that you should have 40% of your portfolio in stocks. It's a rule of thumb, which means it's not always right, and sometimes it's very outdated. This is not necessarily always the best move, especially in a down market. So you just want to be really careful about using kind of those old rules of thumb, one size fits all solutions for things like particularly turbulent financial times. So if you are looking for help, one of my big recommendations is to look for a certified financial planner, a CFP. That's an excellent choice. It's a very specific designation. It is hard to achieve and attain. They are held to a very certain standard. And you want to look for somebody who has experience specifically working with retirees, and you really want to understand how any financial advisor you're working with gets paid. A fee-only planner really makes the relationship clean and easy. It means you are paying them a flat fee, they are providing you a service. If you work with somebody who is fee-based or works on commission, it means that they earn money for selling you a product. And that can, as we all know, kind of complicate the relationship of who you're getting money advice from. So a fee-only certified financial planner keeps the relationship clean and simple. And you also want to make sure that anyone you are working with adheres to the fiduciary standard, meaning they're required to act in your best interest. Another consideration for those who are close to or currently retired is aiming to have at least 1 year worth of living expenses in cash or cash equivalents, whether that's in your investment portfolio or just in your savings account. It can help make sure that you do not have to sell your investments while the market is down and going back to locking in your losses. And some financial professionals actually will even advise having 3 to 5 years worth of expenses in cash in your portfolio. A lot of that also obviously has to do with risk tolerance. If you have the opportunity to, earn income while you're retired, all of these kinds of things. And then having cash will, like I mentioned, help you avoid selling investments during a down market, which can further exacerbate financial pain. It is important to understand that if you have little to no cash and have to sell assets at a loss during a down market, it then does reduce the overall value of your portfolio and can put the long-term success of your portfolio at risk. So those who are also not currently on a fixed income, if you are not yet retired, you should also consider aggressively paying off any high interest rate debt that you have. That's like putting money back in your pocket if you can get rid of any credit card debt or any other high interest rate debt. And then finally, for all of us, shoring up cash reserves, paying off high interest debt, these are all great things to do in uncertain economic times. One piece of advice I actually always give people is to simulate a budget before you actually experience it. So if you currently have a really steady job, a nice paycheck, and you can simulate living on your bare essentials budget, try it for 1 month, try it for 3 months, and then the gap between how much you're earning and what you're actually spending, put that difference in your savings account. Use it as an opportunity to really bolster your emergency fund. Your bare essential living number also can be the bedrock of your emergency savings fund. So if you're paying off high interest rate debt, you should have at least 1 month of bare essential living expenses in a high yield savings account, earning at least 3% APY. If you are not in high interest rate debt, I would recommend the classic advice of 6 months, maybe even 9 months. Again, these unprecedented times, but it's really hard to achieve that goal as well. So focus first. If you don't currently have a nice, healthy emergency savings fund, focus first on 1 month of bare essential living expenses and then keep working from there. Again, recommendation to pay off high interest rate debt. And also protect your credit score. Keeping your credit score healthy and keeping it high, and by that I mean 700 plus is ideal, but definitely 680 or higher. This puts you in a position that if should you need access to a loan or to a credit card, having a higher credit score is going to put you in the position to get approved. And a final thing, because I want to open up for a couple more questions before we wrap up, be prepared to pivot, AKA diversify income. The reason I didn't spend a ton of time on this is we actually have an excellent webinar already that we did a few years ago about how to diversify your income. So I would love for those who have a lot of questions about that to go check it out. But a final and major consideration is reflecting on and making moves to diversify your income now instead of waiting for the bottom to fall out. Start thinking, even start laying the groundwork, or even start doing anything you can to diversify what your current ways of earning an income are. Teaching, coaching, hosting workshops, editing, consulting, building a newsletter behind a paywall, writing in another genre that may be lucrative, like romance honestly tends to excel in a recession. It always does well, but in a recession, it does extremely well. Brand partnerships, working an in-person job, or just tapping into your creative and then practical skill sets beyond writing to earn a living. And I just want to share a couple of quick quotes that I actually love from the Diversifying Income webinar. One, for a little context, this is about folks who feel like diversifying out either into a different genre, doing different kinds of work, might threaten the seriousness of their reputation as a writer or a literary figure. And I love this idea of I'm being taken seriously. I care more about that than my serious reputation. I want to be taken seriously, which I love. Another was the work we take on as freelancers is a reflection of our self-perception. A mistake I see a lot among writers and freelancers is this self-limitation based on our self-perception. And then finally, it's unwise to assume people aren't interested in your many facets and that people aren't able to connect the dots between a fun side project and what is considered high art and what is your important work. I think people more and more today are interested in layers and in the multitude of a self. All right. So I want to open up for a few questions in our last 5 minutes, but I want to leave you with a few recommendations, and we can also follow up in an email. But other webinars to go check out after this: diversifying your income, newsletters, building a community you can own, paying yourself an income on a variable salary, tackling your finances, what authors actually need to know, and investing in retirement planning on a variable income. Those are all in the Authors Guild resource library. Please go find them under the Money Matters. And then finally, we are hosting a panel discussion on April 28th that is an Ask Me Anything about how to handle financial anxiety. So I know I didn't get to all the questions today or even all that were submitted. So please do not hesitate to resubmit, and we might be able to get them on April 28th. All right, let me check in on a few more of your questions. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here today. All right, let me see. Somebody asked, is it a bad time to sell real estate? And I'm unclear, does that mean is it a bad time to become a realtor, or is it a bad time to sell your house? And I frankly cannot answer either, because the question really is, I'm going to say, let's specifically say it's about your house. If you're locked in on a low mortgage rate and you would have a much higher mortgage rate now, that's part of what you need to consider. But housing markets around the country are still incredibly hot. So even if you can sell your house for a great profit, unless you can buy the next house in cash and you're comfortable doing that, and even if you can, the cost of another home can be very high. So unless you're interested in moving somewhere where like, oh, cost of living would be much lower, I can afford this, maybe I even want to turn into a renter, you just want to really think through all of the consequences of making a move like that. How does investing outside of the US affect taxes? So I cannot speak completely thoroughly to this, as I am not an accountant and it's very complicated. You will get a tax document at the end of the year that has information about that you file with your taxes. I am invested in markets outside the United States. I get a little form from my brokerage. I file it with my taxes. I will say it's never majorly impacted my taxes in such a way that I'm like, oh, this was untenable. It also, again, back to the considerations of investing, whether you are inside of a tax advantaged account versus being in a taxable brokerage account, kind of when those tax consequences would hit. I appreciate the advice to speak to a professional advisor. I found it difficult to find a financial advisor who understands the particulars of being a full time freelance writer. What do you recommend in terms of screening questions to find an attuned advisor? Ideally, I'd like to find someone at my brokerage, which is one of the big ones, suggestions. You might want to actually look outside of your brokerage, to be honest. And I only say that because your brokerage specifically might not have somebody on hand who can speak to the specifics of being a freelancer. But there are several tools that you can use to research CFPs. I'm going to say a few of them out loud. We can put them in, I'm just pulling up to make sure I get URLs correct. We can also put them in a follow-up email. There's one that is from the CFP board. So the organization that oversees CFPs is called letsmakeaplan.org. So that is a search tool that they have that you can put in all sorts of filters to look for somebody. And trust me, there are a lot of creatives who are also CFPs. Okay, a lot might be a strong term, but there is a nice overlap, including one that we are going to have on the 28th. So we will also make sure to follow up with her and ask her, what are the questions that we should be asking financial advisors? But truly bringing up particulars of your financial situation and asking them if they've ever worked with a client who has this type of income, these type of questions. You really do want somebody who has a level of either personal experience or professional experience with it. Other organizations, I just want to make sure. There's one that recently rebranded, so I want to make sure I get it right. So XY Planning Network could be one to check out as well. They do tend to be a little bit more Gen X millennial specific, just full disclosure. And then there's one called Garrett Planning Network that also has a financial advisor search tool that you can use that is specific to CFPs as well. Is there any way to estimate when the market might start improving? If I will need to use money in my brokerage account 12 months from now, is it reasonable to hope the market will have improved, if not recovered? I and literally no one else can answer that question, unfortunately. And if we could, we would get so wealthy by being able to time the market and knowing exactly when things are going to improve. So that's just an incredibly difficult part of being invested in the stock market generally. You just don't know. And you do just have to have hedged against the fact that you don't want to have a ton of money sitting outside of the market for too long, but you also want to make sure you have enough cash to sustain should it be a really long downturn, particularly if you are headed to or already in retirement. But again, April 28th, we'll be doing an Ask Me Anything Financial Anxiety edition. I hope to see you all there, or to please submit your questions even if you can't attend. Hopefully we can get to even more at that time and follow up with you about the things that we couldn't dig into even more today.